Williams-Taylor, who is going to introduce our next session.
Good afternoon, everybody. Stephen, is my vocal okay?
You are perfect.
Okay, thank you. And I caught just the last bit of this previous session, and you know, I feel like I'm interrupting a very stimulating and intellectual conversation. So I'm hoping that my introduction will allow a little bit of a turn in the path rather than derailing the conversation. My name is Camille Williams-Taylor. I am the Director of Education for the Ottawa-Carleton District School Board. I do have the privilege of introducing your next speaker, Cam Jones, who is a part of our organization. And I do notice that Superintendent Eric Hardy, that was referenced earlier, he's also on the call. And it is my incredible privilege to have both of these individuals working in our system. Because they certainly both push our thinking about engagement and about the way it is that students learn in a meaningful way. And what I'm hearing in the conversation is certainly a focus on not just teaching, but meaningful teaching and meaningful learning. Several years ago, I attended an elementary school school leaving session. It was a grade 8 event. And in the school, in this event, they had selected a valedictorian. And she referenced a quote that really resonated. And as I thought about preparing for today, it came back to me. The quote is attributed to someone named Alexandra Frenner, who is not a famous person. But the quote said, "The best teachers are those who show you where to look, but don't tell you what to see." And I want you to remember that this was a 13-year-old who'd used this in her valedictory address. Tells you where to look, but not what to see. I think that that really speaks to what we're talking about here as educators, as change agents. It made me think of, as I was preparing for today and looking at that quote again, that teachers really have the opportunity to pull back a curtain and pull back many curtains and many veils that may be before students, but not necessarily tell them what to see and what to make of it when they look behind. And so I would suggest to you that the opportunities that Cam will talk about when we reflect on the approach to learning that is experiential, that when students engage in experiential opportunities, the curtain is pulled back, the veil is lifted, and they're able to see something that they have not seen before and make of it what they will. And for some of our students, that experiential opportunity causes them to see themselves differently, not just the material, not just the stuff, not just the things they read, but see themselves differently and see their possibilities differently. I'm the mother of 3 kids, and my eldest participated in co-op. And in co-op, the co-op opportunity she had was in a hospital in the maternity ward. And one day she called me at work and she said, "Guess what I got to do today? I got to cut the umbilical cord from a vaginal birth." I said, "I beg your pardon?" And she said, "Yes, I was in, you know, they let me in the delivery room, and I was able to watch, and the dad didn't want to cut the cord. So the surgeon or the doctor asked me if I wanted to cut it. And I said to her, 'Do they know you're a high school student?' And she said, you know, but she was committed to the learning. And so the opportunity was given to her. And she saw herself very differently out of that experience, what the possibilities were. And the nurse that she worked with gave her materials to take home over the holiday, the March break holiday, to read. And there were huge books that she'd not engaged with before, but the experience caused her to see a path that was different and she had not contemplated. So as we talk about unlearning, as we talk about revisioning education, as we talk about how it is that we create that that experiential inspiring path forward for students, I do want to challenge that the opportunity does lie in our public school system, that we do have the capacity to lift the veil in that way when we choose to do so. And I think the conversation with Cam this afternoon will give some light and some feedback, some vision, if you will, into what that possibility can look like in the public school system. And we do, when we consider educators as change makers, my perspective is that the role is indeed lifting the veil, showing students where to look, and allowing them to see the world and themselves differently. So with that, I will pass it over to Cam, who is sure to be and promises to be a very engaging participant and leader of a conversation that you seem all very, very prepared to have. So thank you for the opportunity to do this introduction, and I'll pass the mic over to Cam at this point.
Thank you very much, Camille. Stephen, my mic is okay?
You are just beautiful.
Perfect.
5 by 5, as they say in the business.
So we're starting in a way we start most Tuesday evenings at 8 p.m. So I hope you'll bear with us in this odd transition. Welcome to a special edition of the 55-minute question on VoicEd Radio with Stephen Hurley and Cameron Jones. Capacity, agency, democracy, the public good, community, well-being, safety, belonging, trust. Weighty words, and certainly the ingredients that combined make for a child-friendly community beyond home and school. And yet, they are also the right words, as is the sentiment that might suggest words alone, nods of approval alone, a collective of like-minded thinkers alone is enough to make a child-friendly community beyond home and school, let alone a child-friendly home or school. I have a hunch that if asked, a child would say on capacity, "You can't even begin to see mine. You're not programmed to." On agency, at best, I'm an agent at play, less and less so these days. On democracy and the public good, how you treat me is indicative of the injustice in your society. On community, I belong to yours. It's the only one we know. You have no consideration for mine, or the one I create in my vision every day. On safety and well-being, you care for mine as an afterthought in crisis. On belonging and trust, I learned what you meant by these words long before I knew the true meaning of the words. A group of elementary philosophers once gathered. "I wonder what other kids think of me," he said softly. "I wonder what they see. I wonder if they see a good person. Sometimes I'm kind of jealous of the other kids because they can see my face, and I'll never be able to, except in a mirror. And mirrors always distort. Mirrors always distort." An article in the Globe and Mail this week reasoned for an educational focus on how things fit together to reveal a more integrated picture of society. A more integrated picture of society. Because like mirrors, adults distort. We apply constraints, all of us, and quickly define non-negotiable boundaries, which we call reality, the ultimate non-negotiable. We distort to oversimplify the world and the people in it, and to minimize complexities, and to segregate. "Children live questions," writes Christopher Phillips, "and yet for how long in the lifespan of a child do we permit questioning? We distort, and yet children see. They see, and yet we don't acknowledge that they do. So deep is our lack of faith in the capacity of children. We must critique our seeing. We are distorting. Children are simply too curious, and we've lost touch with their reality." This afternoon we ask, what is our belief about the capacity of children for learning? How do we action those beliefs? Can we envision a system of public education that spans a life? And if so, how might this moment be a critical moment for both the public good and public education? Stephen, it's nice to see you for the first time, and it's nice to see everybody else. How are you today?
How many weeks have we been doing this radio show, and I've never laid eyes on Cameron Jones?
Many, many weeks.
People are probably wondering what we're up to here today. Are you going to let them know what this is all about?
Yeah, I think that probably makes some good sense. So, folks, if you'll jump back with me to July, I was literally off the grid with very little access to anything, and I just happened to turn on Twitter, and I saw a tweet from some guy named Stephen Hurley, who suggested that there was a place for the conversations anchored in philosophy that was absent from a lot of the conversation about education. And he wondered, I later found out as a lark, if there was someone who might want to be part of a conversation on VoicEd radio that started there. And despite my lack of bandwidth, I sent a quick message and said, I would love to contribute to that in any way that you see fit. And that led to a few conversations in July and August. And at the end of August, we had our first conversation of about 15 so far, where we look into some questions as deeply as we can, given the constraints of an hour.
Constraints of an hour. And I should let people know that normally on a Tuesday night at 8 o'clock, there's something in this glass, but there's not today. So.
The foundation of the show.
Exactly.
So here's where I thought we could start our conversation, Stephen. And folks, I think it probably makes sense for us to acknowledge that we often have this conversation between the two of us, and we would invite you to join us in whatever way makes sense for you as we kind of navigate through the conversation. But I understand the goal of this 3 days to talk about a child-friendly community beyond home and school. And for me, that conversation then needs to begin with learning. And so in thinking about what we would talk about today, I went to some of the pre-conference resources and was keen to look at some of the stuff from Sir Ken Robinson, who of course has had a dramatic impact on, thinking around education in so many ways for so many years, and in a voice that I think will be missed in person, but I think will a voice that will, transcend his time for a long time to come. And one of the things that I thought, that struck me was something that Sir Ken said. He said, you create your own life by how you see the world and your place in it. And when I read that quote, Stephen, I started going through the flow of our show today, our conversation, pardon me, to find how many times the word see comes in to the quotations and the thoughts that we were kind of discussing before. And the word or the phrase or the concept of seeing was prevalent in Camille's introduction as well, to see oneself. And I'm wondering, when we see a child-friendly community, what are we talking about? What have you heard so far in the conference?
Well, I think there's a sense of honor that I've picked up strongly over the past couple of days, honoring children where they are, not only where they are in this moment, but where they could be in the next moment, in the next year, in the next decade. And I think for me, that's been the most sobering part of this conversation, is the fact that, going back to my own growing up, again, I was told point blank, children should be seen and not heard. And I don't think, and I remember, I'm going to tell you a story, if I could. That's okay for me. It's allowed. Normally I don't have to ask permission. I remember not feeling I had a voice in my own family growing up. And when I was about 28 years old, there were a number of relatives and my family, my father, who usually shut down the conversation, never ask me in his life what I thought about anything until I was 28. And he started in on teachers, and in particular on teachers' unions around a pool in the summertime. And he looked at me all of a sudden and Stephen, you must have an opinion on this. And the whole table went blank and went silent. And they looked at me and I said, I have a lot of opinions, but I'm not used to being asked. And there are relatives in my family that still tell that story, because it was the day that my dad was kind of, it was his day of reckoning and in listening. And so I think over the past couple of days, that sense of listening, that sense of being present and allowing children to be present to us in a way that that honors their present and their capacity.
I got to end my day on Friday in 2 conversations with one grade 4 teacher and another high school teacher. And it was a lovely way to end the week, and in particular with the grade 4 teacher, because this teacher has decided that his learning program is going to be entirely directed by a social enterprise that his students are leading. And often what our conversation turns to as 2 educators on a Friday afternoon is just making sure that we've got all the pieces that we think we have in play when we're talking about what the students are learning. And so he said to me, he was worried about research. He was worried about ensuring that all 24 of his students at some point were going to have an understanding of what it meant to do research. And we got into this lovely conversation, which I premised this way, and maybe I'll premise this way for the room, right? If our collective group of 67 educators decided to get together and research something, I suspect that probably the way that would work is folks who are comfortable in research would probably step forward and take on some of the heavy lifting, which for some of us would mean that we would back away and let that heavy lifting occur. And what I hope would happen, because in some way we are all interested in each other's well-being, is we would start to share our strengths to better the research, right? And so we had this conversation about how can we create the conditions so that the students are having a conversation about research where our role becomes about helping where we're asked to help, or nudging where we're asked to nudge the conversation to, I wonder who you could work with to learn more about that, right? So for example, what are our pillars of research going to be for our social enterprise that's going to drive the success of that enterprise? We're going to come up with that collectively, and then we're going to remind each other our expectations of each other for the research we do for this project, right? And so, you know, it makes me think, Stephen, of your being asked if you had an opinion, but not being used to sharing it. One of the things that I think is so integral to the conversation about what we term student voice is acknowledging that often we don't ask the students where to begin, right? And so what I mean by that is we don't establish what they already know, because we're teaching to something that we've been told to teach. And I think when we have a collection of 24 young people, they have a lot to offer that we never begin to ask about. And so what a beautiful place to start to see where they are and where they want to go, right? And I think that kind of, Stephen, you know, it helps start to understand what agency looks like, I guess is what I'm pointing to.
That word agency, and that's come up a couple of times over the past few days. And yeah, I think you're right. And I think back to Yakov's presentation this morning and the graphics that he presented on a networked learning environment. And I grabbed a couple of screenshots of those and have to go back to them. But I'm curious to find out, in your conversation with this teacher on Friday, did you sense that the classroom community was already established to kind of get to the place where you're visioning they could get to, or is there work to do in that area?
Well, I think not unlike this group, there's always work to do in that area, right? But I'll tell you something that he explained to me, which I thought was beautiful. They decided, to be of the time, they wanted to be a green social enterprise. They wanted to be thinking about sustainability and what that means. And his approach has very much been like, there's a great question. Where do we start? Where can we start to answer those questions and work towards those goals? And so in this case, a student had spent a day creating a beautiful poster, I believe is how it was described to me. And the student came in to the teacher and wanted to print the poster. And during this week, they've decided that part of their social enterprise is going to be to pay the carbon offset so that they are indeed a green social enterprise. And so the student came to print the poster, and the teacher said, I think you need to ask the other student, what's that do to our carbon offset? And so the student yelled over, hey, what's that do to the carbon offset if I print this poster? And the student sort of did a calculation over on that. Yeah, it's going to cost us like $67. And they're, okay, well, do we have a budget for that? Class decided, no, we don't have a budget. Okay, don't print it, right? And so I think they are starting to see each other in a way that we often miss in a classroom, right? They're seeing each other as a collective. They're seeing, I know the word democracy is coming up in this series of conversations. Well, what better example of democracy can you have than a student calculating what a carbon offset is going to be and then deciding whether or not they're going to print a poster, right? But as a group, they're making that decision. And I think I'll say this because it jumps into my head. I think one of the things we also have to acknowledge as educators and as adults is sometimes we see innocuous decisions like that as not being as integral as maybe some other high-level democratic decision, but that is an incredibly democratic decision.
Can you imagine those kids around the dinner table at night asking those same questions of their parents? I mean, yes. But you mentioned them seeing each other in that way. You're also talking about a teacher who has chosen to see them in a different way, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, to his credit, started well before he was convinced that this was the direction to go. He wanted to do this. And so many of the folks that I get to work with in the OCDSB, this is where we start, right? This is not an exercise in, okay, let's come up with a 3-year plan implementation in year 4 with, 10% of what I do. So many folks are absolutely ready to jump in with both feet, and I'll just, as an example of that, another educator teaching in elementary, we did some work with Gary Steger and Sylvia Martinez, and called me the next day and said, I'm ready to go. I'm like both feet in tomorrow. And I said, yeah, fantastic. And we had an idea. We came up with a bit of a conversation as a starting point with a prompt and a project. And she was a little bit nervous. And she said, so Cam, should I just start tomorrow? And I said, well, you can, or I think it was going to be Friday. So I said, why don't you give yourself the weekend. We could, have a conversation and then we could start next week. And she's like, yeah, no, I'm starting tomorrow. And I got to see the inventions and creations of these students who are operating in a scenario where they're trying to return astronauts to Earth from space. And I mean, they're inventing and creating and asking questions that, to be quite frank, I learned earlier this month that the Canadian Space Agency's focus in space right now is human health in space. And these students were having conversations about human health in space unprompted. These were their discoveries that they were thinking about in the context of creating spacecraft and cooling suits and what have you.
Wondering if we could go back. I'm intrigued by this shift in vision, if you will, and different ways of seeing. And I'm wondering, in your own experience, what are some of the things that prevent you? What are some of the barriers that prevent you from seeing in a different way? Because there's that famous anonymous quote. I'm not sure who discovered water, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't a fish. How have you picked up on the barriers to you changing your own vision around kids, around your family, around your spouse?
Sure. Yeah, I think when we're that close, right? We're having a conversation about a community that is a community that I live in. We're having a conversation about a home, which is a home that I live in with 2 children. And I think we often have a vision that doesn't necessarily align with how we action that vision, right? We aspire to a thing, and it's much harder to live in that way than it is to aspire to that way. And I think one of the things, whether it's education or it's community, and I'm hearing Derry talk about trying to evaporate some of this, border that seems to exist between community and school, right? When we let things get operational, they often get in the way of aspirational, right? And I think that's one of the things that we're missing in a lot of the media attention to what it looks like to run school during COVID, is when the operational gets in the way, the aspirational becomes very difficult to reach for. And yet we can reach for it because people are reaching for it right now, right? And I think we have to give, those educators a voice to tell that story. And I'm thinking, keenly right now of Bob Ray's The Three Questions, right? Which is a book that's 20 years old, right? And in the book, he is very clear. Teachers need to start telling the story of education, because if we don't tell the story of education, then people will tell the story for us. And one of the ways that I think we can tell that story is through our learners, right? Had a conversation, again, with the same grade 4 teacher, and one of his concerns is, how are people going to see what I'm doing as learning, right? And that's I think a very significant question in public education, is that we look at teacher effectiveness by what we deem to be what the students are learning. We don't ask the students what they're learning or give them an opportunity to tell the full story of that, right? To tell the process of their learning. We pop into a classroom and we see a product and we say, this teacher is effective or not so effective, right? Teacher performance should not be graded by, I don't think, a moment in time perception or impression of student learning. Student learning is a year-long, multi-year long, panel long, K-12 long and beyond process that takes time.
And we get impatient. I'm thinking back to Derry's story of being a school inspector, and Steve Hall over in the UK told a similar story. And he said, I didn't want to talk to the teacher. I wanted to talk to the kids. So he got down on the carpet and talked to the kids, learned a whole lot about the teacher through talking to the students. And I wanted to go back to your point. I thought it was very powerful about writing the story. And I think teachers have a responsibility. And I remember talking to Alec Kouros out in Saskatchewan a couple of years ago, and he said, we need a new narrative. If we're going to change this place we call school and this thing we call education, we definitely need a new narrative. But I'm wondering, given the context of where we are today, whether it's more than teachers that get to write that story, and to what degree do we allow students to help write that story? To what degree do we allow parents and community members to help write that story? And what would that look like if we invited them into that story writing exercise?
That's a very good question. You're making me think of the work we're doing with Craig Cardiff right now. And so for folks who don't know, Craig Cardiff is a Juno-nominated singer-songwriter in the Eastern Ontario area. And he's working with dozens of classrooms in the board right now on songwriting workshops. And in the end of June, the student songs actually went live on platforms like Apple Music and Spotify. And, Stephen, what I hear you asking is, who gets to tell the stories? And, there's a story that needs to be told, right? Students, not music classes, any students, having, essentially a small window of time, and they hear a songwriter sing, and then he prompts them to write their own lyrics. And then within about 4 workshops, the students have found ways to record songs, and they're sharing tracks across platforms, and they're figuring out how to mix those songs together. And then finding out what it means to join SOCAN and having to figure out how to explain that to their parents, because they're going to be not only having songs available for streaming, but they're going to be part of Canada's, organization of songwriters, right? And they're going to learn about not only the songwriting process, but the artwork attached to that process. And thinking about all of the pieces, all of the inputs that goes into releasing a single song, right? And then we see the song, right? And I think, to come back to the question, Stephen, I think we have to find a way to make process visible, always visible, right? Because the minute that we get stuck on product, we're actually missing the good stuff.
And perhaps the question that I asked was too limited, or wasn't the right question, because I asked about the story, the narrative of school. But maybe the question, again, given where we are and how inspirational this has been, maybe the question becomes writing the story of our lives as individuals, as community. Maybe that story of our lives, of the public, in the public and public education, then requires a different way of looking at schools. Maybe we begin broader and then ask, where do schools fit into that larger story? Again, a different way of seeing ourselves and a different way of seeing our communities.
I'm interested what you think about that.
I knew you were going to do that. I tend to think, and this is, ladies and gentlemen, this is the pause, the pregnant pause that Cameron Jones always throws out there, which makes for great radio. And I never edit them out. What do I think of that? I think in thinking about that question, I think too much emphasis has been placed on kids doing well in school, as opposed to kids doing well in life and in the world. And when you see people like Greta Thunberg sit in front of the parliament in her home city all alone, and then you look at the massive demonstration that led to in Montreal, let's say, that's not about school. That's about something bigger than school. So you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation the word capacity. And I don't think when we look at kids and we place them in school and that's where you have to be and that's what it's all about, getting in and out of school successfully, I don't think we respect the capacity that they have as human beings, that we have as adults who were once kids, or that we have as communities and a society. I just think we're selling ourselves short.
You're making me think, and Camille made me think earlier, of Stuart Shanker, right? And this idea that you see a student differently and you'll see a different student.
Or you see a child differently, right?
Pardon me, see a child differently. I think that applies to all of us, right? And I think the more that and Camille again was using this word of unveiling, right? Of letting us see behind the scenes. I think if we focus too heavily on a metric, and then, you're seeing this in papers on a weekly basis now, maybe not in papers, maybe in digital papers. You're seeing people write about learning loss.
Yeah. And
we're seeing people write about the way that we measure learning loss, right? And one of the things that I get incensed about in that conversation is, how are we measuring something that is lost with the same tool that invariably did not measure that well in the first place, but is now measuring exactly what it's asking about, right? So the example, Stephen, that I've given you before is my 7-year-old was tested for a reading level in the month of September. And it was reported that he was not at grade level for reading. And I took away a lot of things from that conversation. One of the things that I took away from that conversation is, you are not seeing the reader that I see at home. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But we're not measuring for that, because we don't measure for that. right? And there's an expediency to that. I understand some of the press right now where folks are really worried about, if we don't have numbers, any numbers, then how are we going to know, right? And I guess the question that I would ask back is, do we have the tools to actually ask the right questions, right? And so in the case of my 7-year-old, is anyone asking him about the book that he wrote, right? Or the comic book that he made? Well, no, because it didn't happen at school. We need to get past that point now. We need to start to see learning as something that happens in the span of a life. And we need to be able to bring that learning constantly back to the school and constantly back to the conversation about learning, I think.
I'm going to come back to the story of Luke, my 13-year-old, who, unless we had this shutdown, he would have been so immersed in school volleyball, rep baseball, everything else that he wanted to do, that he would not have taken time to look up. And he looked up during this shutdown. And next week, he will be up in the air for the 3rd time in flight school. And that wouldn't have happened. That wouldn't have happened. I said, well, maybe he just wants to be up in the air, which is okay. But last night, unexpectedly, and very surprised that I went into his room, and he, for the first time in my life, I caught him asleep on the bed with a book covering his face. He had fallen asleep reading the textbook that adults would have trouble getting through, that got him ready for his next flight lesson, which was takeoffs and landings, which I think is really important. So we had him in ground school for a couple of weeks, realized that no, he needed the experience, got him up in the air, and now he's going back and figuring out what he needs to know so that he can successfully get this plane up and down, which I think is amazing.
And so I think if we come back to our sort of central question, right, about a child-friendly community beyond home and school, but I think also within school.
And within home.
Well, absolutely. In that story that you just told, we now have to find a way to make that passion central to everything that Luke is learning until he decides that there's something else he wants to focus in on, right? And so case in point, how might that happen? Well, within flight, there is every discrete subject that we cover in the curriculum. And now there's a reason for Luke to learn those things, right? And maybe a reason that didn't exist before now. And so I think that is one of the launch points, the takeoff points for this conversation, is as students discover things that they're passionate about, right? Gary Steger says, as often as he has a microphone, we have an obligation to introduce students to things they don't yet know they love. And when they find out, we should let everything grow from that passion.
The funny thing about that is that my other son, who's in grade 6, is studying flight. So, no, you're not going to do it in grade 8 because you already did it in grade 6. Get over it. We're moving on. I don't know, Cam, and I don't know about you, and I'm embarrassed to admit it in this group. As a parent, I'm not sure I trust Luke, but I don't know if I trust myself enough to let go of the way that I was brought up in order to allow this to happen. I don't know if I have what it takes to step back enough and see things differently. It's my true confessions.
And I think that's probably one of the real constraints for the kind of shift when we start to actually put specifics to a change that we think ought to happen in the system of public education. One of the things that we're going to have to lean into is this idea that my son just came home on Friday with a folder full of stuff. And I believe that that's intended to be an evidence of learning.
Right.
Right? There's backline masters, these put numbers in a thing, there's artwork, which we love. You know, I'm not sure how strong that evidence is, right? And in part of that is on me, is on the home. How many conversations am I actually digging into the question, what did you learn at school today? Right. And I think we've seen some folks write about that. Are you actually asking, or are you using the same tone of voice with your child as you do with a friend when you walk by them and don't have time to talk? You know, are we asking, so tell me about your learning? Or are we saying, so tell me about your learning? Okay. Yeah. You know, it's sort of like a hello, how you doing? Yeah. In a school context, I think we have to start to understand, and this is where that process comes back. We come back to that process piece, is we have to trust a year's growth for a year's input, right? John Hattie's idea. And that means that we have to be comfortable that time plays a factor, right? And I just finished reading Mitch Resnick's book, A Lifelong Kindergarten, pardon me. And that's one of his key messages. We need to give children more time to do projects. It can't be, 1 hour of passion a week. If we're going to ask them to build something, then they ought to be building it as often as they can. And then we tie things in. I use the example of Luke's flight passion right now, right? But if they're in this project, this school that I talked about, where their social enterprise is just starting to go, we can't say, oh, well, sorry, time's up for the social enterprise. We have to move on to other stuff now. We have to find a way to weave the other stuff into the social enterprise. And the minute that they balk on the social enterprise, we have to figure out what's another input that we could get them excited about, and then reveal that it's actually connected to progress in that social enterprise concept, or in the songwriting concept, or in the space concept. Again, right? Because that is part of the learning process. Sometimes you just get bored and you need some other kind of input for a while, and that's okay.
I'm wondering whether we know, here's a rhetorical question. Do schools as they stand now have the capacity to do this work?
You said it's rhetorical, but I'm answering it. The answer is yes, it's happening right now.
Okay.
It's happening right now in this city. As of this morning, I was having conversations about an entire project built around quilting.
Oh, tell me about that.
Teacher is interested about this, and what would quilting look like in a time of social distancing, and can we have craft materials? And this led us to a conversation about the Voyager guitar, right? The guitar that has 67 parts collected from all over Canada. So, this teacher is going to, with her elementary students, come up with what is a quilt, and they're going to go on a learning adventure. And her hope is that they're going to create a quilt. And in her mind right now, probably similar to our minds right now, she sees a quilt. But who knows what that quilt is going to be when we put it in the hands of the learners, right?
So much to talk about.
So much to talk about. I'm wondering if should we turn the mics over?
I think we should. I think this is something we don't normally do, although we do have a telephone platform at VoicEd Radio, and you could call in on a Tuesday night at 8 o'clock. Why don't we open up people's mics and allow them to comment? Allow them. Invite them.
I have one question for you, Stephen.
Yes.
Do you trust yourself?
I don't think I ever learned to trust myself. I think okay, let me rephrase that. I think I'm still learning to trust myself.
I'm going to finish Liz's thought. So what would happen if you gave your son trust right now? Would he learn that much sooner?
You know what? I was thinking about that last night after I left these sessions, and I'm thinking, I need to give him that trust. I need to give it to him for a long period of time, because he's not used to necessarily having it. I mean, I went to the schoolyard last week and found both of my sons, 11 and 13, walking on top of a portable. Now that may seem like an adventure. And I said, adventure notwithstanding. I mean, the day before, someone had gone through a roof of a school in Toronto and died. So as a parent, I'm saying, no. As an adventure loving guy, I'm saying, wow, I wish I had done that when I was a kid, but I don't know. So to the question, I think I need to give it to him for more than just that. I need to open up the window and let it happen.
Baby steps for sure, for yourself as well. So the principle that I used to guide my trust with my children was, if it's not life or morally threatening, let it go. But when my son was climbing trees 60 feet in the air and I was a little nervous, just like you looking at your children on a portable, I said, okay, how about you wear your bicycle helmet?
Oh, yeah. I think I'd be much more successful in adopting that perspective than would his mother. To say that, I may have to work on her.
Can I jump in for a second? A lot of what we're talking about here with the idea of trust is echoed in the notion of deschooling. Deschooling is the name that's given to the period of time when somebody leaves school to become a homeschooler. Often they will take some time to just do nothing. So they're not following curriculum. They're not, they're just taking that time to re-find their intrinsic motivation. And I think it was either Ella or Grace who mentioned that it took her almost 2 years to refine that. Sorry, not Ella, it was Jordan who said that. And that idea of it takes time to find your intrinsic motivation and to find your way to move through life without those external motivators, I think is akin to the idea of learning to trust yourself. So for some follow-up thinking, just looking up deschooling could be an interesting way of exploring that notion of learning to trust ourselves.
I want to add the thought that I think trust is contextual as well, right? So Stephen, you trust yourself to do what we're doing right now live on a radio station that you found, right? That is not a trust to be ignored. I think a lot of children in different contexts, and I alluded to this in the opening, have a lot of trust in, for example, their play. And so I think the entry point to engage that trust in a place where maybe it hasn't been engaged before is to acknowledge where it does exist already, right, and start from there, because I do believe it's there.
Now, Cam, you seem to radiate a lot of trust in yourself. How did you get to be where you are?
I think it might be a bit of a put on, Richard, but I think I believe in the contribution I get to make right now. I'm seeing the contribution and the collaboration and what's happening as students are getting a learning experience that looks like the ones I've described. And I think, do I have doubts? Absolutely. Pardon me, my daughter's medicine is ready. I believe that we're heading in the right direction, I guess is maybe the easiest way to say that, Richard. And I think I'm seeing it as I see the student speaking, right? So I'm not just saying that we need to trust in the student learning and for them to communicate it. That is my gauge. And so if I feel like if it feels like it's working with the students, then it feels like we should keep going in that direction. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Can I say something?
Go ahead.
Cam, I want to agree with something you said, and I want to challenge you. The question was asked, can we do this? Can we do a more student-led, self-directed type of education in the current system? And you said yes. I agree. But I think it takes a massive shift in thinking and in the structures and in the practices of what's happening right now. But I absolutely think we can do it. All the resources, the tools, the people, the infrastructure are there, but we need to change who's in charge. And the thing I want to challenge you on when you said that it's happening right now. And I would say that it's happening in tiny, tiny little specks here and there. You're obviously doing some of that. The quilt project is another. The other project you mentioned is another. But I say this because I often hear this from people. They say, oh, well, school's so much better, and we do this and we do that, and it's project-led and blah, blah, blah. These are tiny things. These are rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. This is not the kind of change that we need. We need transformation. You know, read Wayne Jennings' book on transformation. We need to transform the system, not just adjust the edges. So I just think it's important to say that, because, you know, the letter that I read from the parent, you know, my eldest daughter's 30. I read her that letter. She burst out crying, because the other thing that was said in that letter was that little girl had figured out how to get teachers to like her and what she needed to do to make that happen. And that she noticed, though, that she got away with stuff that the other kids who the teachers didn't like didn't get away with. So the competitive, the putting kids in the same age, I mean, there's just so much in there that is still hurting kids right now. And I just want to be careful that we don't whitewash reality with what's really happening. You know, the whitewashing of the good things, and there are good things. And I agree that there's, you know, teachers go into teaching because they love kids. But the system that we've got right now doesn't need a tweak. It needs a transformation.
And I guess I would ask in response, and maybe you touched on this and I missed it, but, you know, let's define what that transformation is. Let's define what we're talking about.
Go to unschoolingschool.com and you will see my answer. And go see the recorded version. So the core concept is it revolves around putting the control where it should be, which is in the hands of the learner. And that the teachers in the school are there to serve the interests of the learner. And that if we just, you know, if we just rearranged it a bit, we could get that. Marcia, get my back here. What do you have to say?
I just wanted to say, I also think we just have to let go of the notion of knowing what it's going to look like. Like, transformation is always messy, and the process is messy. So I think we have to let go of this idea of an out there destination that we're working towards, and think more about what is the need that we're trying to fulfill, what is the purpose, and what is the general direction that we want to go in, and just let go of this like construct of like this, we have to transform to something. Because pulling in Ian's idea of the butterfly, inside the cocoon, when the butterfly or when the caterpillar dissolves inside of the cocoon to create the butterfly, it completely dissolves. It completely turns into this mushy thing that you will never believe is going to turn into a butterfly. But then it does. So I think we just have to also trust that messy process, and we have to do it together. And there are tools out there to do that.
There are a couple of interesting things happening there, though, right? Because we're calling for a transformation, but we're also calling for being comfortable with the mess. It would strike me that process is the mess, whether we're talking about an individual learner or an individual classroom or a school or a board. That mess is also going to be process, which is actually also slow. Right. And so I'm actually not interested necessarily in the full definition of transformation, but I think we got to talk about what are we working towards. I'm not asking for a fixed metric, far from it. but I think it's really important to recognize that to Heather's point about the Titanic, 95% of Ontario's students are in Ontario's public schools. And so when we're talking about a change in a system, it is going to start at a scale that is invisible to a lot of folks if they're not paying attention. And in the meantime, some of those folks are telling the story of public education without being attached to or aware of that story, right? And so this is where I think that tension exists, right? And I alluded to this in my opening as well, right? We have to critique our own seeing, right? Or we run the risk of seeing what we want to see and ignoring what we don't want to see. And so when we talk about transformation, when we talk about process, let's not pretend like it's happening in small pockets, because that's relative to the water that you're talking about, right? And I would suggest that this kind of learning is happening all over the province, all over the country. And I don't think it's a whitewash, but I think we have to be willing to go and see it, right? And I would just add in closing that it's not, to go and see it is much more difficult in a system of education because it's not always what is front and center, right? These articles that we're seeing in the news right now are not telling the full story because we're not going to ask the people that aren't convenient to the headline.
I would agree with you that it is happening all over the place. And I absolutely think it is, because I think there's great teachers that are what we call responsible subversives that have figured out how to do the right things and do it all over the place. But it is not common. It is not the norm. It is not the general experience of kids. Liz, I saw your hand up. Take it away.
There's other people that had their hand up too, so I won't be long. I just want to ask Cam, and I'm loving this conversation, and I think we need to have more. Cam, what do you think the purpose of education is?
Ooh.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, I hope that education, and I hope to support a shift in education that lets as many children try on as many selves as they want to try on in the process of figuring out a self that they want to contribute to the world with. Right. And so Stephen and I have had that conversation a couple of times on Tuesday nights. And I don't want it to come across as a canned answer, because it's not. That's my children. That's what I want for them. Right. I don't care that my son is telling me he doesn't like math right now because I didn't like math. Right. I want him to see himself as many things as he can figure out and connect those things in as many ways possible. And I sincerely believe that as a folk singer who became a teacher, that those pieces start to fit together. And all of a sudden, the creativity is part of a radio show that I had no idea existed until I accidentally bumped into it on Twitter. Right. So I believe in those connecting those pieces very, very dramatically. I hope that sort of speaks to your question, Liz.
Could we go to Ian had his hand up, and then I think we have to go off the air.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I'll just full disclosure, I've had the great pleasure of collaborating with Cam quite a bit. And so Heather, in answer to your question, I agree, like there's transformation has to happen, but the question of confidence is not just confidence of teachers in the work they're doing or confidence placed in children and youth. It's also confidence of people in our public education system when the dominant narratives are so much against what is being discussed here. These are things you have to balance, because if we get to the point where like having 95% of students in the public education system is a huge plus. If we start driving it down, you lose the ability to change things, right? So you lose a vehicle for it. What I'll say is to Cam's point, and again, we've been involved with hundreds of these projects, working in partnership with both the OCDSB, the CAF board. We'll hear from Alison in a second. I'm really excited for that. It's less, I think, when we talk about like it being a messy process and people wanting to know where it goes, we have to be clear about communicating. It's not about like, you will produce a town hall meeting with your counselor. No, that's not it. What you will have is students who have agency at the end of this. Like, I think we have to start to communicate that the what we're moving towards are the outcomes in terms of attributes or characteristics, instead of like the outputs, like, look at that, we built a house. No, it's far more important that the process, I don't know what we're going to build, but we're going to build something. And along the way, you're going to learn the tools of how, you know, whatever that is. So it's, again, I think what I'm seeing happening more and more in these issues, and I think Cam can only touch on a very brief number of a great multitude that's happening here in Ottawa, is that teachers are increasing as they go through the process, learning that the really important thing that happens is the outcomes for students from the sense of agency, from the sense of I did this, from the sense of, holy crow, someone took me seriously and cared enough to ask me what I thought and what I wanted to do.
You know, I just want to make sure that you don't misunderstand that I'm not advocating for people to leave school or that, you know, that the alternatives are, I fully believe in public education. And I know that's where 90% of the kids are. And that's why I think the change needs to come there, you know?
Absolutely. And I think it's transformation will happen. It's like a Marxist concept of history, right? It's kind of like a mole. It grubs along always, and every once in a while it pops up. And I think it's really important for those of us on this call and around the table that we remark on what seems like maybe an innocuous event, but though, you know, we make a big deal of it. So I'm like, this is progress happening. I don't think there's a top-down approach necessarily that comes in all of a sudden magically have this transformation one. I'm just saying from my perspective, we worked in every high school in Ottawa. We've seen lots of stuff on the ground, and definitely over the last 7 years that I've been involved, I've seen dramatic changes for the good.
Cam Jones, do you want to bring us home?
You're putting me on the spot, Stephen.
Yeah.
I really appreciate the time to have a conversation, and you know, I wish the time was a little bit longer so the conversation could keep going, because I think we're getting somewhere in what we're willing to see, and I think that it really starts there, right? And I think Sir Ken's point was that, and I hope that my opening did some justice to that as well, that we need to start looking around, and the more we look around, I think the closer we get to starting to see a world that I think our children are already seeing for themselves and then being moved away from.
Beautiful. Do you have your exit music there, sir? You're listening to VoicEd Radio. Your voice is right here. So there you go. I'm going to take that hat off and put on the moderator hat, and just let's take a thanks, Cam. Thanks everybody that participated. And I just want to know where to send my my payment for the therapy session, because maybe I'll send it down to Liz. So let's take 5, and we'll come back for our final session of the day.
Well, I was so happy that you were talking about transformations, because the name of my organization is Sky Transformations.
Ah.
And we are attempting to work towards 360-degree solutions through problem solving. I think all of us, like how Yaku has said, we need to have a beautiful networking so that each one of our problem solving abilities can be networked to reduce the problems in the world, in the individual, from the local to the global. That's my request to all. And Richard knows that I do make attempts towards possible networks. And one of the small networks that we are trying parallelly alongside is a Slack group. And those of you who are interested can leave your mail IDs so that I can put you all into that group. And let's start networking in some way, and start doing this process. It's quite easy. If the 760 crore population in the world think of attempting to participate in the problem solving of at least one, it becomes 760 crore problems being attempted to be solved. So let's connect in a big way, and kindly leave your mail IDs so that I can put you into that group for bigger networking. Thank you.